This episode of the Zealous Podcast is sponsored by Perform Better. Perform Better is the leader in functional training by supplying innovative products and top-notch education to trainers, coaches, and therapists. Check out the brand new Perform Better app, designed for professionals who want to stay on top of their game. This free app features education from the world's best. You'll learn from industry leaders including Mike Boyle, Gray Cook, Sue Falzoni, Charlie Weingroff, and many more. Topics range from strength and conditioning, program design, nutrition, business, and marketing. Just go to performbetter.com. In this episode of the Zealous Podcast, I get to chat with a new friend, shall we say, Joel Smith. Joel and I met about a year ago when he had me on his podcast, which is Just Fly Sports. Now, most people in the movement industry and athletic conditioning know of Joel and his podcast because it's one of the most well-listened to podcasts around. And if you don't know Joel, he's a Division I strength coach. He was at Cal Berkeley, but now he's in the Midwest. And his flair and flavor is all about track and field, sprinting, running, jumping, throwing for that matter. And his degrees in exercise science have taken him to several universities. And, well, we're just going to jump right into the conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. But what about like the running community, the jumping, the sprint or fitness community? What's that like in the Midwest?
Sure. Yeah. So, I didn't, when I was in California, I didn't necessarily have like a ton of exposure to what the fitness community was like in the private sector, just because I spent most of my time at UC Berkeley. So, I mean, a little bit, I think that, again, my sample size is kind of small here versus being there. So I couldn't say for sure, but I don't know, like the community, it's maybe you could think of like things as like a small, hardworking community if you're on the country. So the way that people approach fitness, at least at the gym that I'll train athletes out of, is it's a little bit more that like the hard work ethic seems to be like the big thing. So I think maybe in California, there was more practitioners where it was like, you kind of had your own like kind of elite way of, looking at people in different ways and being progressive in how you were coaching athletes or whatever. So at least that's what I'm seeing in this space. So just kind of seeing that culture and that kind of thing. It's but again, I haven't really been in the private sector, spent that much time, in person in the private sector either. So
yeah, that's the interesting part, because one of the things of many that I admire about you and your work is your insatiable hunger to learn more and to rifle through research and to find information that's up to date and relevant. And so, and of course, you would be doing that in the world of academics and being at Berkeley, you're in it. But what is it like to remove yourself from a university setting, being the professional that you are, and enter into the private sector? I don't think I've asked that question to many people, so I'm kind of curious. What are your experiences with that?
Yeah, well, it's been great so far. One of the big reasons I left was actually because if you're a strength coach at a university, I feel like you got about 5 years and you're really topping out with how much you can grow with a specific team, unless you switch teams, unless you're, I'm with swimming and I'm going to go to volleyball, or I'm volleyball and I'm going to go to field hockey or whatever, what I'm saying? Like, and then it's only one age group. And this age group that you work with at the university is the product of 17, 18 years of development beforehand. And so the cool thing now is, and the thing I really want to get into more is seeing that development that happens beforehand and looking into attitudes that revolve around youth sports, especially. And that was one of those things where if you're a strength coach at a university, like you can do everything you possibly can. Like you can do all the research and be on as cutting edge as you can. But at the end of the day, well, one, you are a servant, or you're to everything else the athlete has to do, dictated by their head sport coach. So, but also, you're looking at the product. The athlete that walks in college has had the majority of their development has already happened. And I mean, not that you can't make changes on that level, you absolutely can. But to me, it's more thinking about the mental and emotional process that leads people there. And so I'll be getting I didn't think I'd be doing this right away, but like my daughter's turning 5 and she's in a little like soccer. They got a little like 3-on-3 soccer thing, and I think I'm gonna help coach it. And it's like, and I spent a week or no, I coached 1 day a week last spring season for high school track, like just like as a volunteer, just getting involved. And so I like being not even a strength coach, but just a part of sport on as many levels as I can. Like the 4 or 5-year-old level, I imagine as my children grow up, I will. And then the high school level, I'm working with some older adult clients here and there, which is a lot of fun. And I feel like the more perspectives I can have, then that I hopefully will help me to like, I've heard it's like lanterns, and those lanterns can converge eventually as you get more experience. So that's the goal, is just to experience more of this whole thing.
Well, that's great. Yeah, beware of being a soccer coach because you'll get sucked in for about 12 years. At least that's my experience. But it was all good. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. In fact, it was a sport that I did not grow up with, and now I can't get it out of my blood. I mean, with the European or the CONCACAF or the World Cup next year and so on. Well, anyway, it's fascinating that you're looking at where these athletes in the college years have come from. And I'm curious, Joel, like we're in such a strange culture now than ever before, meaning that the kids that are growing up now, as I have read, have a shorter life expectancy than their parents did before them, because 70% of our culture is overweight and obese, and that there is a lack of purposeful physical movement on a regular basis. And kids are getting smartphones as young as 5 or 6 or 7 years old. That is taking them away from the ideal movement patterns or just the simple act of play. So I'm curious, where does that come in to the mental, emotional components of building an athlete from that beginning?
Yeah, that's another thing too that's been cool. Not even like going to different places to train people, but even just at my home. One of the reasons we chose the neighborhood that we are now in was when we were driving down the street, the first thing I saw was 2 little girls selling lemonade on the corner. And then, all American neighborhood, right? And then you keep going and there's like 3 boys playing baseball, and there was just kids playing. And I remember just not seeing that when I was in Berkeley. And I remember when I was in Berkeley talking to a guy, I think it was like he was a homeless guy, talking about how he had like 20 years ago, it wasn't like that in Berkeley. Kids were playing on the street. And so it's interesting to see, like, we have lots of kids that are outside all the time playing, and yeah, they're inside playing video games. But that was one of the things that drew me to this place, because I want my children to see those kids playing next door. And in talking to their parents, that was a big influence on their children, is there was other older neighbor kids that they're observing and they're mirroring. And like, so that culture is really profound. What is interesting though, as you mentioned, the smartphones, or you could say like the nutrition, is I see kids in my neighborhood playing all the time, but there's kids who, like, this was fun, is one day I didn't bring my timing system, but we decided to set up a 40-yard dash in the street. And the kids like loved it. They all wanted to do it because they watched football, and they're like, oh, I want my 40. And they were just racing each other and having fun. One of the 9-year-olds, or maybe it was 9 or 10, like tweaked his TFL or hip flexor or something doing that. And this is a kid who plays all the time, right? Like, there's no way a 9-year-old should ever tweak a TFL. You know what I'm saying? And yes. But I think it's diet. It's as simple as that. Is I will be at some neighbors' houses, and my neighbors are awesome. Like, they're all awesome people, but it's just interesting to see, like, they're having like a little get together. There's no vegetables, and the kids are eating like a bunch of ice cream sandwiches. And it's just like, people don't, there just isn't a respect for all the things that put together like a healthy and functional human being. I don't see the kids around here on their phones, which is good. I actually was just having a conversation with a mom whose son is maybe a 10 or 11, and maybe 11, and all his friends have smartphones, and he wants one, but she wouldn't let him get one and doesn't plan on it. And I think it just started like a flip phone coalition. But yeah, that overstimulation, it screws up the dopamine response too. So yeah, it's interesting. It's so much. It's like so many things that I think are suppressing that true growth, even if the kids are playing, and they're doing the things they should be.
But then add to that the single sport athlete all year round, which is something that's emerged more in the last couple of decades than ever before. I mean, when you and I were growing up, we every season would be the start of a new sport. In the fall, it would be soccer or football. In the wintertime, for me, ice hockey or street hockey. In the spring, it was baseball or whatever it was. And of course, summertime was just all play with the kids in the neighborhood. But these days, I mean, soccer is a great example of it. There's so many families that have their kids in fall soccer, then the winter break, and then there's spring soccer, and then there's here in Santa Cruz, we've got beach soccer. So what do you say to that? I mean, you look at research and so on. Are we seeing an increase of sports injuries occurring at younger ages because of poor nutrition, single sports, and a reduction of physical movement or an increase in technology?
Yeah, I think actually, to me, I actually wouldn't. It might sound a little counterintuitive. This is more from hearing it from others than it is directly seeing it. But because all the kids in my neighborhood play a lot of sports, but in some countries like Dominican Republic, it's baseball. You know, in Brazil, it's soccer. But what they'll do is they'll just play different versions of that sport. You know, like maybe they're hitting a stick in the street or something, and they're still doing all sorts of movements and playing. So I actually wouldn't. I think this early specialization, it just depends. Early specialization is going to really harm a kid if there's a lot of pressure behind it. If there's no pressure, like I think in those countries, it's like it's all playing. It's always play. So as long as it's always play and it's different variations and you're doing movements outside of it, I don't think it's as bad. What kills us, in my opinion, is the pressure. And even if for multi-sport kids, talking with the neighborhood parents, these kids are like 10 and 11, and there's pressure to make these club teams at these young ages to keep making it up to the next level. And I don't care if you play one sport or two or three, like that pressure early on is so counterproductive. It does not, it hurts the athlete on a lot of levels. And I think it really stifles their long-term development. And we would just be so much better off if we could, how do you change that system though is the key, right? Like how do you, because everyone wants a college scholarship and they see that like maybe that's it. Maybe the NCAA will dissolve and colleges will crumble with the economic stuff, and then there won't be scholarships anymore. And maybe that'll take care of it. I don't know. I mean, maybe some things need to crumble before they can actually fix, you know? But I mean, I can tell you, I already kind of, I'm trying to kind of build my roadmap now by talking to other parents and thinking about how do you survive this. Like Lee Taft is a speed expert and just sport expert was on my podcast a few times, and he's almost got like the survival map for children in AAU sports, which is basically I think like they don't travel or something like that, or like it's some way he gamed that system where like they were still in it but they weren't doing all the stuff the other kids were. Wow. I think there should be. I was actually thinking it'd be fun to create like some survival manual to like somehow game the system, you know. Anyways, yeah, it's a mess, but it's been fun at least starting to understand it and by seeing it and being in it more to understand maybe some ways to, help is a strong word because it does start at the parents and you're fighting a big system. But I think it's just the thing where you feel like you can just do a good job with your children. I think that can resonate and. So, you know, we're in it. We're kind of getting there.
Oh yeah. Fortunately, I want to say that I'm not through it, but we're in the second half is where we are right now.
Yeah.
One's off to college, the other one's in the midst of high school. But still, I hear what you're saying. There is pressure in the competitive world, much more so than say recreational levels of sports. It would be great if there was something blended together. We just spoke of technology. There's a lot of great wearable tech out there. And then there's a lot of stuff that's just flooding the market that I don't know where it will land in terms of its place. But what are some go-to wearable tech that you have benefited from or that you're excited about? Is there anything out there right now?
Oh, like in terms of all the health and fitness trackers?
I know a lot of NBA players, MLB, they've been using Whoop, and there's some others. Garmin's got some stuff for, of course, the cycling crowd and the running crowd. But is there anything that you're using for your clients right now or is it strictly non-tech that you're using?
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I mean, in the perfect world or at the core, I'm I'm actually as little technology as humanly possible type person. Like it's the last thing, or I'll try everything to be innate and nature oriented first, and then if we need technology, we could use it or to get some feedback and, make sure my subconscious isn't like looping and biasing itself and stuff like that. But I will say I'll defer to what Bobby Stroop said, who works with Patrick Mahomes and has founded APEC in Tyler, Texas. But he likes Whoop, and he likes it because it's competitive. It creates a game for athletes almost to max out their score. And if it creates a game and it's fun, then I think that is really beneficial. And shoot, maybe they could get something like that going for kids too. If you like ate vegetables or something like that, or if you maybe you get +10 for vegetables. If you know the soil science of where they came from, then it's +100. That'd be hilarious. Yeah, we need some funny people to write that one. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think could infiltrate people's understanding truly of what it is to actually be healthy and be doing those things. It could be almost that. That's just kind of off the top of my head. But anyways, I don't use this up a lot. I kind of want to get an Oura ring, like a sleep ring. I probably should. I don't know. I haven't had the time, or not the time, but it's just I haven't put it together to get one of those myself. And a lot of times I'll use it on myself first. If I like it, I'll put it out, down the line to athletes and things like that. But that's all I really have about that one.
Well, aside from being with your daughter and doing a little bit of soccer coaching here and there, it sounds like a lot of your time is on this program that you're in the midst of developing and almost releasing. I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, most of my time now, I would say it's split about 4 ways between training clients online, training some clients in person, not as much, training myself, and then developing the curriculum. And so, yeah, I have been spending a lot of time doing the curriculum for this course. It was interesting because before I was working on this online course, it's called Elastic Essentials. I was working on a book on the foot. It's called Best Foot Forward. That was almost done, but it's one of those things where I was just like, I just don't feel like I've put this into practice quite enough. It's one of those things where it's really easy to, in my shoes, talk with a lot of foot experts, go through it a little bit, find a few situations that I know it worked, but I just needed more. I just needed more skin in the game. So I put the book on the shelf for about a year, and I'm glad I did because I've actually come up with some really good stuff in the meantime. But yeah, the interim project was an online course, which I always wanted to do. And it's called Elastic Essentials because I think as I spent time as a university strength coach and you see strength and conditioning and you see the way that, and I actually, back before my job at UC Berkeley and my early internships at strength and conditioning, I did not want to be a strength coach because it was presented to me as, here are these lifts, do them this way. It had nothing to do with the human body at all. There was zero to do with the human body. It was only about these lifts and these are the instructions and do them this way because I said so, and a lot of yelling and stuff like that. And not that that's bad. I think that yelling in context and when an athlete needs it is great. But if that's like your main weapon and you don't really know what you're doing outside of that, there's definitely a lot on the table. And so even in going through university, I worked with a lot of awesome coaches at UC Berkeley for sure. It was just interesting to notice, and even outside, just in seeing what other people are doing on social media, you notice that, or especially like looking at like watching the interns that came up there, I would say was a big one, is people who want to get in the industry because they like a lift or they like Olympic lifts, they like CrossFit, they like bodybuilding. And so to them, that's like, oh, well, what's a job? Oh, you could be a college strength coach. I'll do that. But these aren't people who are fans of how the human body works. They don't have an appreciation for that. They just care about, fitness exploits. And it's almost like the bridge to working with athletes starts with a lift, a sport that's not how the human body works. And so I feel like the paradigm needs to flip where it's like, no, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, it's all a tool. Here's how, if you look at like the feet, the pelvis and the rib cage and space, how do we start there and work from the feet upwards and use that in plyometrics and how we develop running and all the lifts we do and those types of things. So that's the course. It's, as with me, I always put way more in it than I should. So that's why I take it a little longer, but it's getting there. We got about a third of the way left of recording and it should be out by September here.
I gotta say that's so refreshing. I just everything you just said right now, and what dissuaded you, but yeah, but not turning away from being a strength coach at the same time and feeling like you can make some change within, which is, I think, between the two of us, what we have in common with that. And lifts are just lifts, and if that's what you're, like you say, if that's the foundation of your approach and not how the human body moves, then there expect a lot of pain and suffering somewhere down the road for your athletes. So that's fantastic. Now, your background is track and field, javelin, high jump, and so on. And I think that probably really plays into this quite well because track and field athletes are not traditionally known to hit the weight room in the same fashion as, say, football or basketball players have been in the past. So, would you say that that's accurate, first of all?
I think if you go to a lot of like university weight rooms and you watch how the track team trains, it's probably pretty similar to how most other teams train for the most part, to be honest. I think that
They're
it just
still
depends.
biased on their lifts. They're still just like more lift centric than actual biomechanics.
Yeah, well, this is just the problem with this is the problem with strength and conditioning. This is in my mind
Yeah.
on the university sport level. I mean, I think I get it for team sports like football for sure. I think that well, it's really your model. Like this is almost like what I think the perfect model would be like let's say football, particularly is you have a high performance manager who manages like maybe the workloads and the data and the catapult and those things and is like an advisor. But then like the quarterbacks coach should be doing the lifting for the quarterbacks. The receivers coach should be doing the lifting for the receivers. The lineman coach should be doing you should know that if I'm coaching these athletes, like you wouldn't like the throws coach always writes the lifting programs at universities because it's like this with what they do. So it's interesting. I find it interesting that all of a sudden when we get into a team sport, you don't have that. You should know that if you're working with those athletes is what I'm saying. But I think there is this thing in the NCAA where there's a 8 and 20 hour periods. And so there's like, by default, there's gonna be time when the strength coach has more time with athletes. And I'm not saying this to discredit any university strength coaches at all by any means. I think there's a lot of people working really hard who are really good at what they do. But at the end of the day, I just think the system is a little bit flawed in that perspective. And so what I'll say with track is track, if any sport, should again be the same thing. Like it should be the sport coaches who are doing the lifting, like writing the lifting, because you should know that. Like if I'm a jumps coach at track or a sprint coach, I should know what lifting I want. And usually what happens at those universities is the track coach does either just hand the strength coach a piece of paper saying, hey, this is what I want. Sometimes, they'll let the strength coach do it in the fall. That's why I think a lot of strength coaches at universities don't like to work with track, because that's what happens. So, but I will say even then, I find, and not just university, but everywhere and talking to other coaches, is track thrives on compression, like, and not in a good way. Like, I mean, a lot of high performing, I would call them cells of really successful track sprint groups, really successful jump groups, not just on college, I'm talking international, like from Europe, from the Caribbean, from different parts of the United States. Like these athletes will do really well, but there's tons of injuries. And I've found, at least anecdotally, that these groups that really thrive on these heavy compressive like work schemes, like heavy quarter squats, heavy half squats, like heavy step ups, that being or heavy jump squats, those athletes, those groups are much more frequently injured. But it's funny because I don't know if the coaches like think about that, why that is, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's where I do think you need some high compressive things to maximize output, but it's also something that you really have to be careful of, and gives athletes somewhere to go too. Like if you used it all up, early on, where are you going to go next year? And so, yeah, I think that where I've gone with that stuff for track, I train a lot of like masters track athletes online, actually in particular, but some younger track athletes as well. And I will say, not to pump my own ego at all, I just feel like I've gotten to this place where over time, I think I've finally kind of cracked some of the keys to top end speed, because people talk about how hard that is to improve. And a lot of it is just managing the way I do running, I think, is different than a lot of people, but I also don't do nearly as much bilateral lifting as I used to. That's like the special thing that you get once in a while. It's not like you're just entitled to that every time you walk in the weight room. And I know we talked about that back a year ago too, and we sat down for that podcast, and the 80-20 rule that you had told me with how humans move. I just think if we fit to that, strength and conditioning would be such a better place, and we would all be moving and feeling so much better, versus it's usually like the other way around. It's the 80-20 in favor of bilateral, and then you do some single leg as like the cool down or something. That's kind of funny.
It really is. And I don't want to say that it's two schools of thought necessarily, but that heavy compressive load seems to be more about the how many W's, the competition, and the wins that you achieve, regardless or without taking the athlete necessarily into consideration. Whereas, say, Elastic Essentials, from what I'm gathering here, is more about biomechanics of the body. How can we load eccentrically into the tissue to get the most response and the most power output? And that's going to reduce the most potential for injury. We're going to have least potential for injury there. So it's more centered around the athlete. And not to say that they can't produce just as much force as the heavy compressive, but it's almost like we're just going to stick weight on this guy because we know it's going to give us more power any way they can generate it. And yes, there's going to be injuries that come along with it. You know what I'm trying to get to?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think about this a lot too, it's funny. You'll have different people say different things, but I think about like, I think the term is like the zeitgeist is the term. It's like the general kind of vibe of the generation. And I think that, in some ways, some people have said we're we're too young right now. There's too much like expansion. We work too much. We work too hard. There's too much pressure. I would say that's for the most part pretty accurate. I found it interesting. Like there's a paper in China, like in China now, there's like the lie down flat group there that just like, we're sick of it. We're just going to lie down and not, we're going to take ourselves out of this pressure spiral, because they have it too. I mean, America, it's everywhere. Right. And I just think that it's where you see it anywhere, you see it everywhere. And so athletics gets it is just pure. It's so quantitative. I was on a podcast where they asked me, in talking about the foot, they're like, well, how do you get the most force in the least amount of time? I'm like, it's not about that. It's about the optimal force in the optimal time. It's like you have to use the whole foot in the way that fits your output. It's not just like double leg RSI, just bam, 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 because I've maxed that out, and it doesn't actually help everything else as much as you'd think it does. There's a specificity. And so I just think the industry is so hung up on these hard endpoints, either like grind it out, hit training, like that's one, like CrossFit, like really grind it out, hit, maximize your body composition, look good in a co-ed room, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think there's something cool about that at the same time, but if you take it too far, it's not going to be good for you in many ways. Same thing with sports performance. It's most force, minimal time, max intent. Okay, great. How long can you keep training like that and still be good? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
How do you set things up from the core to be better? And then, data, and how are we analyzing? It's kind of like we're flooded by data. I mean, I'm sure it's a great piece of technology, but you have a little thing that can watch you lift and, stuff on the bar. And it's like, we're so far from I just had Graham Morris on my podcast, strength coach from Australia. He's like, when I was growing up, I just did farm work and played sports. And I think that's so. There's a reason why the Rocky movies strike so close to home, but with Stallone, like when he's training out there in the wilderness, I think it strikes such an emotional chord, because inside of each of us, we just know how critical it is to our overall development that we actually get away from technology and that we make the best with what we have.
It's so funny, Joel. I honestly believe that the next quote unquote gym or health club is going to be somebody's back 40, their farm. And they're going to say, okay, you're going to take this wheelbarrow over there. You're going to throw the hay bale up on this loft. We're just going to do good old fashioned American farm work. And because the farm strength is so much more complete than the traditional gym approach. So I honestly, we've got a group here in Santa Cruz. and it's all geared toward being outdoors and working outside. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some franchise right now that's building. It's going to have a farm silo as their logo or something like that, because it's just like that. I swear, Midwest, where do we get a lot of the college players coming from? At least the linemen, the big guys, they're coming from the Corn Belt. There's no surprise there. But you brought up the foot, and we both share this common affinity or affection for the lower extremities and how it contacts the ground. But there was a time in my own learning process where it was negated. I was looking at posture from the head to the ankles, and it was just how it was taught. And I was a lemming running off the cliff with all the other students without paying attention to the complexity, the beauty, and the integrative relationship that the foot has with the rest of the body. And I'm wondering, what drew you downward to the foot? When did you start to get engaged with it, so to speak?
Yeah, I think trying to think of kind of the exact point. I think the turning point, I'll say the turning point for me was when I had a guy, his name's Chong Ji. He was on my podcast like 4 years ago, and his website and brand is called The Secret of Athleticism. And he was just showing the foot of like Michael Jordan, or pretty much any basketball player, anyone who's explosive. And I was looking at those feet, which usually the common trend is the toes are a little kind of have a hooked quality. They're not hammer toes, they're not gripping the ground, but there is like a curve. And then there's like these tendons kind of popping out on the top of the foot, and you can see a little tibia anterior tendon coming out. And I saw that, and I was like, yep, that just resonated with everything I've seen in my life with people who are explosive and really can jump high. And right about the time that I was talking to him, there was a guy on the Cal swim team who just could jump out of the gym. I mean, just a frog. And as well as there's also a guy named Andy Nicholson who's 50 now. I think he can still dunk a basketball at 5'11". So I was looking at those two individuals, and I noticed the same trends. Was they had both of those feet characteristics, and they also had really long, like second and third toes that had this hooked quality and these calluses on the top actually from that hook. And I would watch those athletes jump compared to athletes who didn't have that same ability. And I really, one of the most interesting memories I had was, on the just jump mat, which we would test verticals on. One athlete, this guy who had these long hooked toes, he could jump 41 inches on that thing, which in reality is maybe like a true 34-inch vertical, but it's still pretty darn good. And there was another guy who was jumping like 29 or 30, which might be like a true 24-inch vertical or something like that. I don't know how that jump mat converts, but two guys jumping almost a foot apart who have the same lifting ability, like the same lifts, they lift the same weight. In fact, the guy jumping lower, I think, might have been a little bit stronger in a lot of the lifts. In fact, I know he was on a lot of them. And if you watch the guy who didn't jump as high, I would watch his toes. And I'm like, how many strength coaches watch people's toes when people jump, right? But like the guy who wasn't jumping very well, as soon as he would go to reverse the jump, instantly all his toes would just grip down into the ground, but not in like a good way. Like in like the arches aren't working very well. So we need to try to get stability and bite down. And you could see almost like a kink in the middle of them, like it was like a tent type setup. And I'm just like, this is why this starts from the ground up. You know, like this is the foundation of this all. And then everything else kind of goes upwards. And so I just remember, I always heard track coaches talk about it. Chris Corfus, who's been a sprint coach who I have a lot of respect for, and I learned an awful lot from early in my career and now when he's on my podcast as well. But he's been into the foot forever. And so seeing a lot of those people be into the foot really sparked my interest. And then lastly, just spending time with Darian Barr, who's a little bit north of you. He was always one too who, like, you know, Chongji would be talking about the hyper arch, and then Darian would be like, oh, well, what about this too? And it was almost like we were taking these other concepts, and I was listening to Darian's take on it, and he had a lot of really cool like sensory pieces to train the foot. So training the foot not by telling you to do something, but he would have a piece of carbon fiber or Kevlar or plastic, and he would lay it on the ground, just say stand on it, and your arches would just form up like, and I would run in those shoes and just feel like $1 million. I mean, it was amazing. So that stuff. Yeah, it was a lot of those types of influences. And so then that's why naturally I'm like, I got to write a book on the foot. So we're partway through it.
Right on. Okay, then from the foot, we've got Obviously, muscles, which for the most part, the conventional approach, traditional approach, has been very muscle centric. We've been focusing on major muscles, and then it came into accessory or smaller muscle groups, and we got into the core, and everyone's got their definition about that. However, we've also got joint mechanics, and when a joint moves, it affects all the tissue. So now there's groups of people that are looking more at joint action and forgetting, so to speak, about the big muscle groups, and knowing that if the joint moves here, then the muscles have to respond in kind. But then take it even further, we've got, of course, fascia research that's coming out more and more, like Bill Parisi with the Parisi Speed School. He's connected with Robert Schleip and over in Germany, and they're doing the Fascial Training Academy. But then there's also the tendons. And this is long-winded, but I mean, we could actually take different movements that are focused on these separate areas. Like, I want to do some fascial training, but then I want to do some jump training to elicit more of tendinous response, or I want to go deeper with my range of motion to hit the muscular response. Like, how do you filter this all down with your philosophy and training? Do you consider all of these things, or you just go, I just want the guy to move better, I don't care how I do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know Gary Ward's had a huge impact on your work, and I learned so much from you just spending time with you with that lunge matrix, and just the knee not going straight ahead but over the big toe, and then learning how to like like when you kind of gap my foot a little bit with the wedges in a certain way. I was doing a valve slide reverse crossover, and if the wedges weren't there, it hurt, but then you put the wedges there and it felt good, and my range of motion got better. It's like, open up the joints, let the joints do their thing, and then the brain likes it. And in doing those lunges too, I had never felt like I finally understood what Gary was talking about when he talks about getting the VMO to fire and getting the glutes to fire, and really appreciating. I just had Connor Harris was just on my podcast talking about even like adduction range in like a mid squat position. So, and how that can light up the glutes more, because it can stretch them. They can stretch more. They can, and just the idea that, hey, if you want your glutes to work. And I watched how athletes train. I see this in context now, and so much in the sense of like all these athletes will do single leg glute, hip thrusts and stuff. And I'm not saying that's a bad lift. I think it's good, but everyone just is in love with the lockout, the end range. No one cares about how the glutes load themselves, and that's everything when it comes to getting getting it to set up and work. So I do think I will say, on one frame of things, like that joints act and muscles react, and learning to pronate properly, and especially single leg in the lifting to fully get that spectrum. And then Gary Ward's cogs, like I really like even like the lunging and the full twisting, and getting that arch to flatten a little bit and the knee to come in, and like feeling all the muscles that light up. I really, that's where I really do take that. I do a lot more single leg work now than I ever did. And especially even with meeting you and the step up that we did that I put on Instagram. I just call it the natural step up. I could have called it Rocky step up.
Don't put my name in it.
Yeah, I just call it the natural step up. So I use that all the time for static stuff. But then on the flip side of things, I think, and this is something I've grown into, and this, I think this might diverge a little bit from the pure joints act and muscles react, because I think there's also co-contractions that are important to act as brakes. And Darian Barr talks about movement as a series of isos, even more than eccentric and concentric. Once you're rolling, it's more like yield iso, yield iso, yield iso. Like it's almost like the joint is either moving or it's being stopped. And it's really like explosive isometric contractions that are in charge of that. And so I think about one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is co-contractions, and particularly like the ability even to tap your heel, to put one leg in front of the other and just be up on the ball of the foot, and then just kind of like having that heel just tap, 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 tap. And athletes who can create you have to create co-contractions to do that around the ankle, around the knee. And I'm seeing it more and more, the athletes who are just bad at that, even an iso lunge, for example, you're doing an isometric in place lunge hold, and the ability to strongly contract your hamstring and just create like almost like a brace that fixes that knee in place. You know what I'm saying? Like so that whatever you're doing, there's those strong isometric contractions. I watch athletes who what I would say are poor movers, and their shin will just swing out of control in the front side when they're running. Like they just don't have the co-contractions there that hold everything together. And we did this the other day. It was a group of distance runners, and there was a jump mat that measured RSI at the gym. And so I'm like, hey, let's test your vertical, let's see how that is. And then we did a single leg reactive strengths where they just hopped and popped up on one leg. So, and what I found is that the standing vertical actually didn't really correlate to their running ability that much, but single leg reactive strength pop did. That was big time. And the funny thing is the girl who was the worst, who probably would have the worst feet, quote unquote, in that group, like kind of her calcaneuses were real everted, real flat feet. Even if she stood on one leg, she would actually be in a little bit of pain if she would do it for like more than 45 seconds. And we had to put a wedge to give her calcaneus a little bit back into inversion. But when she does that single leg RSI, like somehow she gets it together. Like she kind of runs more on her toe and pronates off the side a little bit to like, she's just so skilled at actually almost overriding kind of poor joint action with strategic co-contractions to put the foot where it needs to. And I had heard David Gray talk about that. Some people who just, you see them standing and they just looks like garbage, and then they start moving and they can actually figure it out. And so when she did the single leg reactive strength, the one thing that stood out with her more so than any other person, and she was way better at this, like almost twice as good as some people, is you watch her heel bone and you just see this little like tap, 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 like this little like twitch in her heel bone right before she would jump on and off the mat. Whereas other people, it just look like a single leg squat, just slow on the mat, slow. She's had like this twitch going, and to me, that's just like these co-contractions, just pop, pop, pop. They're stabilizing it isometrically. So yeah, I would say yes on one side, on a pure movement side, like if I'm doing strength, yeah, let's do those rotations and the work that you're doing has inspired me there, Gary Ward stuff. But I'm moving very much into like really getting people into those strategic co-contractions too, like being able to hit those on the other side. So that's more the muscle side of things.
I love that because I'm actually doing the same thing from a different, I guess, different approach. This is with Dr. Eric Cobb and Z Health and that educational system, where putting people in actually sports specific positions and then getting their body to move three-dimensional space while holding that position, right? And just getting them to, whether we're feeding the proprioceptors, the mechanoreceptors, getting them to create the co-contractions, but it has been remarkable. I mean, yes, we're doing the other movements to try to create better biomechanics, but actually placing them in loaded positions and having them move and shift their weight in different places has had tremendous effects. And I can't point to, is this muscular contraction? Is this the viscosity and the elastic response of the fascia? Is it more tendinous? Or is it just a smattering of everything? I know that I'm just going to change the speed of motion, change the tempo, create novelty of movements, create novelty of direction, in that case of load too. And it's been fantastic what we've been getting out of the athletes that we've been training.
Yeah,
so, go ahead.
That's awesome. I'd love to see that sometime. That sounds like really interesting. How you all about that?
It's been really fun. So just looking down the road here in the future, we've got Elastic Essentials coming out hopefully this fall, right? You're about 2/3 of the way done. Maybe it'll be a kind of early Christmas present on a lot of strength coaches' doors. But do you see yourself, now that you're in the private sector, is there this inkling that, maybe if I just work in a community college nearby, or maybe there's just some research assistant needing a little bit of help? Are you there yet? Or you just close your door on the world of academic, or you want to get back in a little bit?
I have this feeling like I think I would enjoy being a high school track coach for a while, to be honest. Like a head track coach. I don't know, it's just like it can be frustrating if you're kind of like, if you're an assistant and the athletes are getting run like a ton and they're all getting like shin splints and they don't have a lot left for some of their other movements. So I think that the next thing, at least in line, I'm not planning to return to university anytime soon, to be honest. I've enjoyed my time being able to, I feel like I've almost gotten, I could live lifetimes, I guess, being a college track coach, but I feel like my time in my 6 years as a college track coach, then 8 years as a college strength coach I think it gave me what I needed. out of those things. And I had the opportunity to work with some really good athletes who taught me a lot and achieved really high performances. I mean, and again, I was just a strength coach, so it's not like I'm not tooting my own horn for anything. At least maybe I could just say I didn't mess them up. But I mean, as a strength coach on